Apologies, had to restart my PC, so it took a little longer to get going this morning. So today it's on CPU firmware updates. As usual, we'll go straight into it. If you have any questions, just pop them in and we'll get them at the end.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar. In this webinar, we will show you how to perform firmware updates on Horner Modular CPUs. The new line of Horner Modular CPUs have been a popular product for some time now. Today, we will go through a few different ways of updating the firmware on your CPU. Let's begin. Here is the agenda for today. We will start this webinar with a review of the Horner OCS Modular CPU range. Then, we will go through where to find the corresponding firmware files for each CPU on the Horner website. After that, we will go through the different update methods available for each model. There will be demonstrations of each method afterwards, and we will finish with a Q&A session. As of recording, there are 3 Horner modular CPUs on the market: the CPU 200, the CPU 250, and the CPU 300. These can be sorted into 2 categories, with the CPU 200 and the CPU 250 in one group, and the CPU 300 in another, as shown on the current slide. These groups are defined by the capabilities of each CPU. The first group are the CPUs closest in spec to a micro series all-in-one controller, and so the recommended mode of firmware updating is the same as the one for the microcontrollers, which is the Cscape update method. This involves connecting the controller to a computer via USB and initiating an update through Cscape. We will demonstrate this method later in today's webinar. This method is also the only one that can update the firmware and the bootloader. The other methods we will discuss can only update the firmware. These other methods are the load button update method and the system register bit update method. All these methods will also be demonstrated later in this webinar. The other group of CPUs features the CPU 300, which is closest in spec to a Canvas series all-in-one controller. This group does not have support for the Cscape update method. However, they do feature HMI Connect touchscreen support, which allows for firmware updates to be performed from within the system recovery menu. This is the preferred method, but you can also use the system menu update method and the system register bit update method. All of these methods will be demonstrated later in this webinar. We are going to start with the CPU 300 and all the methods available to that controller. First, for all methods, we need to source the firmware files from the Horner website. Navigate to hornerautomation.eu and under Support, navigate to Firmware. Here, you can select your CPU from the list. In our case, it's under Modular CPUs CPU 300. With the firmware files downloaded, we then need to prepare them and place them on an external storage device. First, insert a micro SD card or USB drive, which is formatted using FAT and has no bootable partitions. Then, navigate to the CPU 300 firmware files and extract all its contents. This should give you a file named Canvas Fullset, and it's this file that we will copy to the root of our external storage device. Then, eject the device and insert it into your CPU 300. Next, let's move to the bench and show you the 2 different ways of applying this firmware update. There are 2 ways to perform the update, either through the built-in screen or the HMI Connect touchscreen. We will start by demonstrating the built-in screen method. Enter the system menu by pressing the center button, then press and hold the right arrow key until the system recovery menu options appear. From here, select the system upgrade options and then choose SD or USB as the file's source corresponding to what type of device you used to store the firmware files on. Then hit the enter button to confirm your choice and the update will begin. This can take a few minutes depending on the size of the update, and the controller will reboot a few times during installation. Once it's finished, however, we'll be returned to the home screen and you can verify that the update was installed correctly by checking the firmware version number at the top here. Now we are going to demonstrate the system recovery update method on the HMI Connect touchscreen. Press the upper right hand corner of the touchscreen until the function keys appear. Press and hold the system button until the system recovery screen appears. Then scroll down until you see the System Update SD and System Update USB icons appear. Select whichever one applies, depending on where you placed your system update files. In this case, we will select System Update SD as our files are located on a micro SD card. A pop-up menu will appear asking us to confirm our choice. Pressing Yes will begin the update. This can take a few minutes, depending on the size of the update, and the controller will reboot a few times during installation. Once it's finished, however, we'll be returned to the home screen, and you can verify that the update was installed correctly by checking the firmware version number displayed on the onboard screen. The final update method for the CPU 300, which we will show you today, is the System Register Update method. This method is ideal if you want to start a firmware update from logic. First, prepare the firmware files as previously shown and place them on either a micro SD card or USB drive. Then, create Boolean variables tied to specific system register bits as shown on the right. Then, simply manipulate and monitor these variables as per the flowchart on the next slide. Here's the flowchart. Make note of the key in the bottom right hand corner, which shows you the box colors and what actions they represent. To start, the user would set the SD update variable to 1. This could also be the USB update variable if you were using a USB drive instead. Then, following the flowchart, the confirm update variable should be set to a 1 automatically and then cleared to 0 when the update is complete. This update method might have more niche use cases, but we felt it was important to cover nonetheless. Now we will turn our attention towards the CPU 200 and the CPU 250 firmware update methods. As stated previously, these CPUs are micro-class products with the same specifications and capabilities as micro OCS all-in-one controllers. Similarly, these CPUs primarily receive firmware updates using Cscape and a USB cable connection. Additionally, this method is the only one that allows for bootloader updating as well. How can you tell if the bootloader needs to be updated? The release notes will clearly state whether or not a full update, meaning an update which includes a bootloader update, is required. If a bootloader update is required, then the Cscape update method must be used. First, to source the firmware files, navigate to the hornerautomation.eu website. Then, under Support, navigate to Firmware. Here, you can select your CPU from the list. In our case, it's under Modular CPUs, CPU 250/CPU 200. With the files downloaded, we now need to prepare them for our removable media device. When you extract the downloaded zip file this time, however, you will get an executable file. This executable is made for ease of setup, meaning this install process might otherwise be confusing or time-consuming, but with the executable, takes only a few clicks. Follow the instructions provided by the install wizard, and it'll ask you to provide the firmware folder for your Cscape install. For most users, the default path should work just fine. However, if you've installed Cscape in a different location, then you will have to manually provide the new path. The install wizard will then automatically copy all the appropriate firmware files to this firmware folder. From here, you would then perform a standard update using Cscape. We won't demonstrate this process today, as the full details are available in the firmware update manual. However, don't worry, as it's a relatively simple process and shouldn't take too long. The entire procedure is laid out on pages 2 and 3. And as previously mentioned, this update method is the only method that allows you to update the bootloader as well as the firmware. The bootloader update specifically is laid out in page 2. But if you don't need to update the bootloader, then there is an alternative update method you can use, the microSD update method. As before, extract your downloaded firmware files and run the executable. Follow the instructions provided by the install wizard. However, this time you will have to specify the mounted location for the microSD drive on your computer. The installation wizard will automatically copy all the appropriate firmware files to the root directory of that device. With that complete, you can then eject the microSD card from your computer and insert it into your controller. We will now move to the bench and demonstrate how to install this update on the controller itself. We recommend you back up your program before starting any firmware updates, for safety reasons. With the microSD inserted, press and hold the load button for 3 seconds, then release it. The update should then initiate, as seen by the Run and OK LEDs beginning alternately blinking at 1 Hz. As long as these LEDs are blinking, the update is still installing. This should only take a few minutes depending on the size of the update. But when it's complete, the LED will stop blinking. Once complete, the CPU will reset and the unit will begin executing the new firmware. Just like the CPU 300, we can also configure the CPU 200 and 250 to update using system registers. To do this, we first need to connect our controller to Cscape. Then, we prepare the firmware files as previously discussed on the microSD or USB drive. Then, in Cscape, we create Boolean variables tied to system register bits as shown in the table on the right. Finally, we can manipulate and monitor the variables as shown on the flowchart in the next slide. This flowchart is quite a bit simpler. We can start the update by turning on the SD update bit. Then a status bit will be turned on by the CPU. Then, once the update is complete, the initial bit that started the process will be turned off and the update bit will be cleared. That concludes our webinar for today. We hope you learned something new about performing firmware updates on the Horner Modular CPU range. Thank you so much for listening, and the Q&A session will begin shortly.
Okay, so as usual, the webinar registration links are up on the website as well as the newsletter that will have been sent out. So we are back on again next week. Okay, I think we can leave it there for today. Thank you for joining. We'll do it next time.